Working the night shift at Jimmy John's had its perks and downsides. The late hours, the rush to get everything delivered within 5 minutes, the sleepy streets, and the odd customers that kept ordering until 3 a.m. were all part of the job. I knew my delivery radius like the back of my hand. It was small, but being in a busy tourist area, there was never a shortage of orders. The night shift could be eerie, sure, but it was manageable. One night, I got an order around 2:30 a.m. Just as the orders were slowing down, I looked at the receipt and recognized the address immediately. It was for a business complex on the edge of our delivery area. During the day, it was bustling with office workers and delivery orders, but at night, the place shut down like clockwork. I figured maybe it was someone waiting in their car or pulling an all-nighter. It wasn't unheard of for someone to park there and make a late-night order. I packed up the sandwich and drink, tucked the receipt into my pocket, and headed out. The drive was short, and as I approached the complex, a familiar unease crept over me. It was dark, darker than usual, with no streetlights nearby. The building loomed ahead, an empty shell with not a light on inside. The parking lot was deserted, except for one vehicle. A white van was parked way back in the corner under a large tree, half hidden by shadow. The sight of it made my skin crawl. I slowed down, my headlights washing over the asphalt and leaving long, dark shadows. There was no movement, no sign of life, just a stillness that felt unnatural, like everything had been paused. I parked, staring at the van, waiting for any kind of movement. Nothing. My fingers drummed on the steering wheel. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt wrong, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I glanced at the receipt again, took a deep breath, and picked up my phone to call the number on the order. It rang a few times before someone answered. The voice was deep and rough, almost too calm. He said to come to the van. A shiver ran down my spine. I looked back at the van, its windows completely blacked out. My gut twisted. I hesitated, staring at the empty building, the shadows in the lot, and the van that seemed to absorb the light from my car. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay put, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe it was just someone messing around or a guy waiting for his food in his car. I opened the car door and stepped out. The night air felt colder than before, wrapping around me in a suffocating chill. I took a few cautious steps forward, my eyes fixed on the van. The parking lot was silent, almost too silent. My footsteps echoed, and each sound seemed louder than it should have been. Halfway to the van, my stomach turned. I could feel eyes on me, that sensation of being watched but not knowing from where. The van remained motionless, yet the weight of the darkness felt oppressive. I stopped, heart pounding. I couldn't go any further. The warning bells in my head were deafening now. I turned back to my car and walked quickly, not running but moving as fast as I could without breaking into a sprint. I got in, locked the doors, and glanced at the van one last time. No movement. Just the deep, unsettling quiet. I drove back to the shop, my pulse racing and my eyes darting to the rearview mirror the entire way. No one followed me. The road stayed empty. When I got back, I told the manager what had happened. He listened with a raised brow, nodded, and shrugged. He said sometimes people played pranks or placed fake orders, especially in areas like ours. There wasn't much we could do other than make a note of it. The address was too common during the day to blacklist. No one called to complain about the missed order, and we never heard anything more about it. A few nights later, things were back to normal, but I couldn't shake the memory of that van, the voice, and the feeling that I'd been watched. I never wanted to know what would have happened if I had walked all the way to that van. That night was the only time I ever felt true fear on a delivery, and I'm thankful I trusted my instincts and didn't find out what might have been waiting for me in that shadowy corner of the lot. There was something. I wasn't used to picking up late shifts, but I needed the extra cash, so I decided to take a graveyard shift at the pizza place I'd been working at for the last few months. It was past midnight, and with only a few hours left on my shift, I figured it would be a quiet night. Since it was so late, the place was practically empty except for me, another driver named Emily, and our manager Todd. Emily had been working the late shifts for a while, and was used to the strange calls and occasional weirdos. She was good at brushing them off, telling me that you learned quickly in this line of work not to take anything personally. We had a good flow going, with her running most of the deliveries and me handling the calls and making pizzas with Todd. Around 2 a.m., the phone rang, and I answered it. The voice on the other end was strange, low, and almost a whisper. The man ordered a large pepperoni pizza and asked for Emily specifically. I thought it was odd, but I didn't question it. People often got to know the delivery drivers by name, especially the regulars. Emily shrugged it off, saying it was probably some guy with a crush. But just as she was about to grab the pizza and head out, she got a call on her cell. Her face changed immediately, going from calm to serious. She explained that it was a family emergency, and she had to leave. She apologized to Todd and handed the delivery over to me. I told her not to worry, that I'd take it from here. She gave me a quick, grateful nod before rushing out the door. I could tell she was stressed, so I didn't ask any questions. Todd handed me the pizza, and I punched the address into my phone's GPS. The place was in a part of town that no one really liked going to, especially at night. Rundown buildings lined the streets, and most of them looked abandoned. The few lights that were still working flickered, casting eerie shadows that made everything look worse than it already was. I was already regretting taking this delivery as I pulled into the parking lot of a shabby 4-story apartment building. I took a deep breath, grabbed the pizza, and made my way toward the entrance. The lobby was empty, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell that hinted at years of neglect. My footsteps echoed as I crossed the floor and started down a narrow hallway lined with flickering fluorescent lights. The carpet was stained, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I moved deeper into the building, I passed a few people lingering in the hallways. They were rough-looking guys, each of them standing against the wall or sitting on the floor, staring at me as I walked by. Their eyes followed me, unblinking, sizing me up. I tried not to make eye contact, but it was hard not to notice the way they whispered to each other as I passed, giving me a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning until I finally reached the door number listed on the order. I stopped in front of it, the feeling of dread intensifying. I knocked, and after a few seconds, the door creaked open just a crack. A guy stood there, peering out with one eye. His face was pale, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was greasy, sticking to his forehead, and his eyes were bloodshot. He asked where the girl was. His voice was barely above a growl. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. I told him she had a last-minute emergency, so I took her place for the delivery. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable. His eyes narrowed, and I could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. The silence between us was thick, tense, and every instinct in me screamed to get out of there. Finally, he grunted and held out a few crumpled bills, snatching the pizza from my hands. As I turned to leave, I could feel his eyes burning into the back of my head. I walked quickly back down the hallway, but I wasn't alone. I noticed that the men who had been standing in the hallway earlier were still there, watching me with expressions that now looked angry and disappointed. It was like they were all part of something, all upset that I wasn't Emily. I forced myself to keep walking, not daring to look back. My heart pounded in my chest, and my palms were slick with sweat as I made my way back to the exit. Each step felt heavier than the last, and I kept waiting for someone to reach out and grab me. I didn't dare look back, just focused on putting one foot in front of the other, until I finally reached the lobby. When I stepped outside, I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool night air. My hands were shaking as I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I looked back at the building, half expecting to see someone watching me from a window. But the windows were dark and I was alone. When I got back to the store, Todd noticed the look on my face and asked if I was okay. I told him about the delivery, about how the guy had asked specifically for Emily, and how all the men in the hallway seemed upset that I was there instead. I could see the concern in Todd's eyes as he listened. Todd shook his head slowly. He said, "We'll make a note not to take any more deliveries to that address." He said, "It sounds like we dodged a bullet tonight." I nodded, a wave of relief washing over me as the tension in my shoulders eased. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if Emily had been the one to make that delivery. The way those guys had looked at me, it was clear they'd been expecting her. As I clocked out and headed home, the events of the night replayed over and over and over in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had been waiting for her in that building, something that had nothing to do with pizza. For the next few days, I kept an eye on the news, half expecting to see a headline about something happening at that apartment complex, but nothing came up. It was like the whole thing had been some twisted near-miss moment that only I knew about. I never told Emily the details. She left the job a few weeks later for unrelated reasons, but I was grateful every time I saw her come in safe and sound. I'd never been a superstitious person, but after that night I started thinking that maybe I'd been meant to take that delivery instead of her. A strange stroke of luck or fate that had put me in the line of danger instead of her. As for that building and those men, they became part of the unspoken list of places our little pizza shop didn't deliver to anymore. Just a quiet rule among us, a precaution taken without explanation. I don't know what those men were planning that night, but I know one thing: I'll always be thankful that I took Emily's place. It makes my stomach turn to think about what might have happened to her if she'd been the one to knock on that door. Working as a DoorDash driver is perfect for someone like me. I get to set my own hours, take it easy during the day, and make enough money to scrape by during the night rush. It's not a glamorous life, but it's freedom, and that's all I really care about. Besides, I get to spend most of my time in my Jeep, which I consider my loyal companion. It's tricked out and rugged, perfect for off-roading with the guys on weekends. My Jeep is more than just a vehicle, it's like a partner, always ready for adventure. One night I got a strange order that threw me off. It was from this small Chinese place on the outskirts of town, a place I barely ever go to. When I checked the delivery address, I did a double take. The drop-off was far, almost in the next town over, way past my usual radius. I frowned, wondering why the app even allowed this order to go through. I almost rejected it, knowing it'd mess up my tip per hour average, but I decided to take it. I figured a long drive on a quiet night might be relaxing, and at least I'd have my music in the open road. As I headed out of town, the lights grew sparse, and the city buzz faded into silence. It was just me, my Jeep, and the dark road stretching ahead. At first it was kind of peaceful. The stars were out, and the air was crisp, but the deeper I drove, the more unsettling it felt. The streetlights became fewer and farther between, and the trees lining the road seemed to close in, casting thick shadows that my headlights barely cut through. I turned up my music to drown out the quiet, but it didn't help much. Something about the area just felt wrong, like I shouldn't be there. I told myself to relax, it was just another delivery. But the GPS kept leading me further into nowhere, until I finally saw a faded old sign with the name of the neighborhood. If you could even call it a neighborhood. It was more like a random collection of trailers and rundown houses hidden away in the woods. The GPS directed me onto a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for my Jeep. I slowed down, squinting through the dark to find the right house. When I finally pulled up to the address, I felt a chill run down my spine. The place looked abandoned. The windows were dark, a couple of them shattered, and the yard was completely overgrown with weeds. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for a long time. I waited in the Jeep for a minute, hoping someone would come out to grab their food. Nothing. The silence felt thick and unnatural. I double-checked the address and called the customer, but the phone just rang and rang, no answer. I waited a little longer, trying to shake off the unease creeping over me. After the app's timer finally ran out, I forfeited the order. No one was coming for this food. I was annoyed, to say the least. I had wasted my time on a dead-end delivery that threw off my night's rhythm. But hey, at least I got a free meal out of it. I tossed the food onto the passenger seat, ready to dig in once I got back to the city. I took one last look at the dark, empty house, shook my head, and started heading back. The drive back was even more eerie. The dark roads felt endless, stretching out in front of me like they were trying to pull me further into nowhere. I was just about ready to chalk it up as a strange night and put it behind me when I saw something up ahead. A row of cars was blocking the road. Trucks mostly, big ones, parked in a way that left no room for me to squeeze through. I slowed down, my stomach sinking as I saw a group of men get out of the trucks. They looked rough, all built like linebackers with scruffy faces and hard eyes. A couple of them held bats, and one had a wrench. They started moving toward me, spreading out like they were going to surround the Jeep. My heart started pounding. Something was definitely wrong here. One of the guys, the biggest of the bunch, motioned for me to roll down my window. I hesitated, gripping the steering wheel. He waved me forward, and I could see the frustration on his face when I didn't move. My brain was screaming at me to get out of there, but I didn't know if I could. The trucks were blocking the road, and these guys didn't look like they'd be easy to push past. Then it hit me. The order, the weird address, the abandoned house. It was like someone had lured me out here on purpose. But for what? I didn't want to stick around to find out. Without thinking, I yanked the Jeep into reverse, wheels spinning as I backed up. The guys started shouting, some of them moving toward me faster, but I didn't care. I slammed the Jeep into gear and took off down the narrow shoulder, heading for the trees. I knew the Jeep could handle the rough terrain after all. It was built for off-roading. I just hoped it was enough to get me out of there. The guys started scrambling back to their trucks, but the road was too narrow for them to turn around as fast as I could maneuver off-road. I veered off the shoulder and into the trees, my headlights bouncing over rocks and dips in the ground. The Jeep's suspension groaned, but it held up, and I pressed on, weaving through the woods and hoping I was putting enough distance between myself and the blocked road. My heart was racing and I could still hear their shouts faintly in the distance. But as I got further away, the noise faded, replaced by the crunch of gravel and branches under my tires. I didn't dare slow down. I just kept going, letting the Jeep do what it did best, until I saw a familiar stretch of road up ahead. When I finally pulled onto the main road, I felt like I could breathe again. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those trucks barreling down on me, but there was nothing, just the dark, empty road stretching out behind me. By the time I got back to town, I was still shaking. I parked in an empty lot, trying to collect myself. I thought about the whole strange setup, the long delivery, the abandoned house, and then I thought about those guys in their trucks. If I hadn't had my Jeep, if I had been driving something that couldn't handle the rough terrain, I might not have gotten out of there. As I drove home that night, I made a mental note to stick to my usual radius from now on. No more strange addresses. No more trips out into the middle of nowhere. I'd stick to the well-lit, busy streets where I knew I'd be safe. And as I finally pulled into my driveway, I patted the dashboard of my Jeep, grateful for my loyal companion and vowing to never take it for granted again. It was late on a Friday evening when I came home from work feeling exhausted and ready to relax. My week had been relentless, and I'd been counting down the hours until I could finally unwind. As I reached my apartment door, I spotted something unusual, a large plain brown package sitting right outside, propped up against the doorframe. I hesitated, looking around the hallway to see if any neighbors might have left it there by mistake, but the hall was empty and silent. The package was unmarked with no postage, no delivery service label, no return address. The only writing on it was my name and address, scrawled in a neat but unsettlingly precise handwriting. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands. There was an odd heaviness to it, almost as if it was weighted down by something more than just paper or cardboard. At first I thought it might be a mix-up. I didn't remember ordering anything, and I definitely wasn't expecting a delivery. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to bring it inside. I set the package down on my coffee table and sat across from it, just staring at it for a moment. I didn't know why, but something about the plainness of the box made me feel uneasy. After a few seconds, I took a deep breath and carefully opened it, lifting the flaps with growing apprehension. Inside, there were stacks of photographs. I sifted through them, my hands shaking as I began to recognize each image. They were all of me, hundreds of them, taken from different angles and locations around town. Some were close up, others taken from a distance. I recognized places I frequented, the park I walked through every morning, the corner coffee shop where I liked to read, even the grocery store down the block. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been following me for weeks, maybe months. I couldn't believe it. Every picture felt like an invasion, each one documenting a piece of my daily routine that I thought was private. There were even shots taken from across the street from my apartment building, capturing me through the windows of my own home. I dropped the photos, feeling sick. The worst part was a particular shot, a picture of me sleeping, taken from outside my bedroom window. I had no idea how anyone could get that close without me knowing. I'd always assumed my home was safe, a place where I could be myself without anyone watching. But now it felt violated, like the walls themselves had been peeled back. After a few moments of panic, I called the police. When they arrived, I showed them the photos, hoping they'd find some clue or lead. But after a thorough search, they told me there were no fingerprints on the package, nothing that could help trace it back to whoever sent it. They asked if I had any enemies or if anyone had been acting suspicious around me, but I couldn't think of anyone. The officers took the package and the photos with them, assuring me they'd do their best to investigate. But after they left, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. In fact, it only grew stronger. In the days that followed, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every time I left my apartment, I found myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the faces of people passing by. I started noticing strange things inside my apartment too. Little things like my kitchen chairs being slightly out of place, or my books on the shelf arranged differently than how I'd left them. At first, I tried to brush it off as paranoia. I thought maybe I was just imagining things, letting my fear get the best of me. But then I began noticing other things. Small items went missing. My favorite coffee mug was gone one morning, even though I was certain I'd washed it and left it on the counter. A scarf I'd draped over my bedroom chair disappeared, only to reappear in my hallway closet a few days later. Then came the night I woke up to find a note slipped under my door. It was just a small piece of paper with a single sentence. "Did you like the photos?" The sight of it made my blood run cold. I picked up the note, my hands shaking. Whoever had sent me the package wasn't just watching me from a distance. They were here, inside my building, close enough to leave messages for me. The thought terrified me. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, every small noise making me jump. I was afraid to even close my eyes, as though doing so might let them slip back in without me noticing. I went back to the police the next morning, showing them the note. But again, they didn't find any clues. They told me to be vigilant, but it felt like empty advice. They had no leads, and I had no idea how to protect myself. From that point on, I couldn't relax in my own apartment. I felt like every corner held a shadow. Every creak in the floorboards was someone sneaking around. I even changed my locks, hoping that would keep whoever it was at bay. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough. A few nights later, I was lying in bed when I heard something, a faint scraping sound from the hallway outside my door. I froze, listening intently, my heart racing. The sound stopped, then started again, as if someone was dragging something slowly across the floor. I gathered my courage, tiptoeing to the door and peeking through the peephole. At first I saw nothing but the empty hallway, but then a shadow shifted and I saw a figure moving just out of view. I held my breath, barely daring to blink. After a few moments, the shadow disappeared, leaving me alone in silence once more. The next morning, I packed up everything I could carry and left the apartment. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whoever was watching me. I moved to a different part of the city, a place where no one knew my name, and I've tried to put it all behind me. But even now, every time I check my mail, I feel a surge of dread, half expecting to see another unmarked package sitting on my doorstep. I don't know who sent that first package or why, and maybe it's better if I never find out. But I still check over my shoulder everywhere I go, always scanning the crowd for a familiar face, because once you know you're being watched, it's impossible to ever feel safe again.